Hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Rich Woman Rising podcast. I'm your host, Eloise Tompkins, and I'm a money confidence coach and psychologist. And I love helping women to heal their relationship with money using body based techniques. And today, I want to talk to you about a skill that many of us might be missing, which might be impacting how much money we're making in our business, which is setting boundaries. I don't know about you, but I know that I have seen women before who have been so confident and self assured, and they've walked into meetings and they've owned the space that they're in. They've been able to just command respect from other people without even trying. And I remember looking at them and being like, what is it that you have that I don't have? How are you doing that? And now I've learned through my own journey with boundary setting and self worth that it comes down to being able to set a boundary. And when we're setting boundaries, we are owning our worth. We are owning the fact that we're worthy of setting that boundary. It's a wild concept. Well, it was a wild concept to me. So I want to share a little bit of that with you because I hate the advice fake it till you make it. I think that is the shittest advice because what does that even mean? Fake what until you make it? Don't get me wrong. I think that it's helpful to do things and try them out, but I don't think that you can fake confidence. I think that you really need to embody that confidence. And I guess it has its merit in some ways because we can take small actions and build them up over time. But I don't know, when I think of fake it till you make it, I think back to one boss that I had. And she was intimidating. I was intimidated by her. And we worked in a pretty male dominated industry. And well, at least at the senior levels anyway. In the junior levels, which was me, there were quite a few women who were doing the grunt work. But in terms of senior leadership, it was very male dominated. And I remember that she would walk into meetings and she would be loud and she would be opinionated and she would be on top of things. And I used to think that that was assertiveness. I used to think that she was confident. But what I realized, I wasn't a psychologist at that point in time. The reason I share that is because now, having worked with so many women in a space as a psychologist, I get to see their really vulnerable moments. And I've worked with a lot of CEOs and business owners and people, women earning a lot of money. So I've seen the vulnerabilities that come with that. And I now look at her and how she was. And I'm like, wow, you're actually really insecure. And you were trying really hard to prove that you belonged in that space. And I think a lot of women can relate to that, particularly in male dominated industries where we feel like we have to work hard to make sure that we are accepted and believed and fit in and are confident so that we're not overshadowed. And like that's a whole separate issue in and of itself, which is kind of that fake it till you make it thing, right? Because she's not actually feeling that confidence within her. She's faking it, but she never actually made it because she never actually felt truly worthy. And that's the difference. I actually want you to feel worthy. I don't want you to be able to do the things, but still feel shit inside and unworthy and undeserving, because that kind of sucks. I want you to have both. I want you to be able to go and set a boundary and do the thing and feel good about yourself on the inside, knowing that you actually deserve to be doing that and taking up that space, having those conversations, being able to handle those conversations without feeling like you need to put on this assertive front or this assertive mask to be able to cope with the difficult things that come up. So, how do boundaries impact our relationship with money anyway? Well, boundaries. Boundaries are things that limits that we have. And our boundaries can be time boundaries, emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, sexual boundaries, gosh, now I've lost like all of the different types of boundaries. Like we have so many, like there are so many different types of boundaries that we can have. And when we don't know what our time boundaries are, or when we break our time boundaries or our energetic boundaries or our spiritual boundaries, and we let them leak over because we feel guilty. Or, well, I've only billed that client for an hour, even though the work took me 3 hours. That's a time boundary leak. Or, and I used to do this, I would listen to friends, would go out for dinner, and they would talk about themselves. And I would barely get a word in. They would feel energized because they've gotten everything off their chest, and I would leave feeling exhausted. That's an emotional and spiritual boundary because I was not pausing the conversation, and they were just taking everything that I had and I was giving it to them. So being able to understand boundaries, what the different types of boundaries, what boundaries are, how to identify what our boundaries is super important so that you can recognize, okay, I've quoted this person for 1 hour of work, and now that I've started it, it's going to probably take me 3 hours. I'm going to reach out to them and say, hey, actually, now that I've looked at the request in more detail, I know that I quoted you for 1 hour. However, I've realized that it's actually going to take me around 3. The new price is da da da. Is that okay? Do you still want me to proceed? Rather than just doing the work, charging the hour, then feeling resentful that your boundary has been violated. Or going out for dinner with a friend, listening to them vent, and then not saying anything. So that can play out in lots of different ways as well, and it correlates with your wealth, because if we're doing things like the undercharging and not going back to them, or, it might be the other thing of over delivering, or you might be taking on other people's financial responsibilities in your business, or you might find yourself people pleasing, doing things that you don't particularly want to do. Someone might ask you to do something and like go out to an event, but you had plans to work on your business, or your business might need you in some way. It's not urgent, but you feel this sense of pressure that you're the CEO of your business, therefore you need to deal with it then and there, missing that experience with your family, even though you could have let it go. Or you might find yourself saying yes without thinking. This is a common one. Someone will ask you something and they'll say, hey, can you do this? And you say yes without thinking. And then you think, oh my goodness, why did I do that? That's a really common one that I see, because we don't pause when someone asks us something. We just automatically respond. And that can all get in the way of your wealth, because your energy is being zapped. Your time's being zapped. Your physical energy is being zapped. Your emotional energy is being zapped. And you're not filling that container. The thing that wealthy people know, who also feel good about themselves, is that it's okay to set boundaries. And, it's really interesting, because I remember when I was first learning about boundaries, because I grew up in a home where there were no boundaries. I was not allowed to have my own boundaries. This is a gross story incoming, so please close your ears if you don't like hearing gross stories. But I remember times in my childhood where there were periods where I use the word periods. There were times when I would have my period as a kid, as a young child, and I would leave my pad in the bathroom while I was having a shower. So I was in the bathroom, I was having a shower, and I don't know, I was nervous about like leaving blood everywhere in the toilet. So I would leave my pad like just in my underwear on the bathroom floor, and I'm waiting to deal with it until I'd showered. And my mum would come in and see it on the floor and would then wrap it up for me. And I remember hating that, because as a kid, I was insecure about my body, going through puberty, and then had mum come into the shower and just like take my pad, my bloody pad from the floor and deal with it. And it didn't matter how many times I said, don't do that, she still would. Or the time that my boyfriend at the time wrote me a love letter and mum went into my room cleaning, air quotes, cleaning. And somehow the letter that was in my drawer that I'd kind of put away in a safe place somehow ended up in the garbage bin with coffee all over it. And I was like, how did that happen? Like, there were just no boundaries. There was no space for me to explore my own boundaries and become my own separate person. And when we don't have that opportunity as kids, it can be really difficult as an adult to kind of be able to set some of those boundaries because we don't know how. So I didn't know how. So I remember for me first starting to explore the concept of boundaries. I remember in this one workplace that I was at, it was such a small example, but I felt so proud of myself. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm that woman who other people look at and command, like they see that respect. What happened is I was sitting down at a table at lunch and I had my lip gloss on the table. And another girl reached over to take my lip gloss off the table. And she went to start opening the tube to use the lip gloss. And in the past, I wouldn't have liked someone doing this, but I would have let it happen because it would have been easier to do that than say something, because I didn't know that I could have said something. But at this point, learning boundaries. So I said, you know what? I'd rather you didn't take my lip gloss without asking, please. And I have never seen someone put a lip gloss down so fast. And she looked at me and she was like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. She puts the lip gloss down and kind of wiggles back in her chair, like just shocked in a positive way though. And from that moment, the dynamic of our relationship shifted. She looked at me in a different way and I could see it. And it was, I can't describe it. It was just this sense of knowing that I had boundaries. She couldn't just do what she wanted and I would be okay with that. There were limits. And that said a lot about her own relationship with boundaries, as much as it said stuff about my relationship with boundaries. And it was a moment for me where I was like, oh, wow, this boundary stuff is really, really powerful. And so we can use our boundaries as a way to create more money in our business. Because if you think about time boundaries, for example, and how many hours you might be working, is that allowing you to have the time that you want to spend elsewhere with your family or your friends or on hobbies? Or is it keeping you chained to your business? Or money boundaries? Are you finding that you're overspending? Are you finding that you're giving money to family when they ask for it because you have more than what they do? And there's that sense of guilt around, oh, but I have more, they have less, therefore I should give them the money. No, you get to have a boundary around money too. You might have relationship boundaries around who your friendships are, how long you spend with them. For example, the friend that I spoke of earlier, I had conversation with her. When we'll go out for dinner, I would say things like, okay, I can only talk about this topic for 10 minutes. You've got 10 minutes max. Then we need to change to a different topic. And it's not easy. However, it's funny how people respond when you share those boundaries with them. Unless they're toxic family members, then sometimes that can be really hard. And that's a whole separate kettle of fish. Communication boundaries in terms of the tone of voice and how people speak to you. For example, if you're employees are speaking to you rudely. And I had a client where she said to me that there was one employee, it was her and her husband, and running a business together, and they had a handful of employees. And she said that one of the employees would completely ignore what she said, completely ignore whatever feedback she had. But when her husband spoke to the employee, who was also a male, the employee was male, the employee would do it, no questions asked. And so communication boundaries is around, well, hey, I'm also your boss. You have to listen to both of us. And if they're not listening, then with boundaries, you get to decide what the consequence of them not meeting that boundary is. It doesn't mean that you change your boundary or you keep reinforcing it or you keep telling the person what the boundary is. And that's something I see over and over again is people will say, well, I've told them my boundary and they're not listening to it. Oh, I can't say this enough. It is not up to the other person to adhere to your boundary. It is up to you to manage the consequence if they do not or are not able to follow through on that boundary. I'll come back to that in a moment. Because there are also energy boundaries, like thinking about the different types of boundaries. There are energy boundaries. How's your energy? Are you getting enough sleep? You're going to bed with enough time? Are you eating? You're giving yourself enough time to rest? These are all boundaries that are going to help you build your wealth. But boundaries are important. Coming back to the idea, though, of how we share boundaries with other people. My gosh, it's a complex one because we have this expectation that if we tell someone what our boundary is, they're just going to listen. And I mean, gosh, in an ideal world, wouldn't that be amazing? Like we just tell someone something and they listen and they change their behavior. Like amazing. That'd be so good. Don't think I've ever met that. I don't think that's ever happened before. Like, I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know that that's possible because we get set in our ways. That's just is what it is. And if that person is important enough to us, then, we'll think, oh, well, how can I shift that behavior around so that the other person feels supported? Sometimes the other person is important to us, but they're incapable of meeting that boundary. And that kind of falls into like toxic family patterns. So for example, with my mum, I had an experience a few years ago where she really overstepped one of my boundaries. And it was a communication boundary. And she said some really inappropriate stuff to me. And I was like, you need to apologize. And if you don't apologize, then my response is going to be that I'm not going to talk to you because that was incredibly hurtful. And she didn't apologize. And that was okay because my consequence was I haven't spoken to her since. And that sounds really extreme. However, there's a long history of other boundary violations that I didn't follow through on. And that was just the icing on the cake. And I think family can be really tough. You might have a different relationship. I hope you have a different relationship with your family where if you were to share a boundary, they would listen and respect that. You might not, and that's okay as well. What I want you to take away from this, though, is that boundary setting is up to you to set and yours to uphold. None of the responsibility falls on the other person. They get a choice. You might set a boundary and say, hey, I don't like it when you speak to me like that. And I really need you to use softer language. I need you to not swear. I need you to not throw the F-bomb around. And they're either going to do that or they're not. And if they don't, then it's up to you to decide, okay, well, how many times am I going to remind them of my boundary before it reaches a point that they're not going to change their behavior. They might not be able to, they might not be willing. What is your consequence then going to be for that? And that becomes up to you to follow through with. And I think this is where people get really stuck with boundaries, because we then think, well, I've shared my boundary and I keep sharing my boundary. They're not listening, but this is my boundary and it's a them thing that they need to fix. No, it becomes a you thing. Well, what is the consequence if they are not able to follow through on that boundary? And I think that's a difficult thing, because often that's where another piece of conflict can come up, in the sense of, well, now I have to say to that person, hey, you're not, I'm noticing that you're finding it really hard. And actually, I'm going to have to fire you because you keep throwing the F-bomb around. And I've said, please don't do that. Like, that's a really, really tough situation to be in. So hence why boundaries are tough. And if you kind of look at it from the bigger picture, you might be able to see that being able to, one, know what your boundaries are, and two, being able to communicate them, and then three, following through on the consequences of people who are not able to adhere to your boundaries in the way that you need them to, becomes difficult, and is why people who do have a strong sense of self-worth are able to implement them easily, because they know that they're worthy enough to be spoken to with respect if they request that if that person values them enough, they will do their best to shift their behavior. It doesn't mean that person's going to get it right all the time. Like, if that person's used to throwing it, like, I swear, I was at a networking event and I'm throwing the F-bombs around and I'm like, whoops, Ellie, like, stop. What are you doing? And I don't mean to, like, I know it's just become part of my DNA. I actually used to, like, the reason that I used to swear so much was because it would really annoy my dad. And it was something that he couldn't control about me. But now it's become habitual. And I catch myself and I'm like, ugh. But it's become so habitual that I forget. Because it was one thing, like, he tried to tell me how to be. And I was like, no, you can't, you don't have that control. And anyway, I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole there. So I guess thinking about your own boundaries and thinking about what you would like them to be. And our emotions often guide our boundaries. So if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling guilty, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling resentful, if you're feeling irritated, if you're feeling, I don't know, I can't think of the emotions that I've just kind of listed off. I don't want to double up on them. They communicate that you may have had a boundary violated. And if you don't know what that boundary is, then it can be difficult to interpret those emotions, because our emotions are just like guides. They're just saying, hello, here's some information, please use me so that you can live as peacefully as possible. That's all emotions really do. They just communicate to us. And they communicate what our boundaries are. And they might be different from what you think. Like, the amount of times that I've seen people who have said they felt a particular way, and it's because a boundary has been violated, but they haven't realized it, is quite common. I want to also acknowledge that people will push back on your boundaries, particularly people who you've had a relationship with for a while. They can find it hard, because essentially when you set boundaries with people, they don't know how to navigate that, because you're trying to change that dynamic of your relationship. And I see this all the time, like, where you're trying to set a boundary and the other person's like, no, that's not how we do things in this relationship. And it's not a conscious thing from their perspective. They're just operating on autopilot, but it's new, it's unusual. And they're like, what's going on? And it can cause a little bit of friction. So that's where it can be helpful to acknowledge that, okay, I'm trying something new. I'm changing how I'm responding and what my boundaries are. And hence why we need to reinforce it and just say, hey, actually, I'm going to stop working at 6 p.m. and I'm not staying back late. I remember when one of my clients did this, actually. This is when I was working, several years ago as a psychologist. And one of my clients would work until like late at night. And she hated it, hated working late at night. And we explored boundaries and the whole concept of boundaries. And her mind was just like blown wide open. And not only would she work late at night, she wouldn't take a lunch break. And we kind of explored time boundaries and energy boundaries. And she was like, oh my goodness, this is like amazing. And she started finishing work earlier and she was able to go to like tennis lessons after work, which is something that she'd wanted to do for the longest time, but wasn't able to because she was working so late. So you can actually get a lot of pleasure from setting these boundaries. So I hope this episode has helped you to understand that you are deserving of setting boundaries. And a way to start setting them can be like small. It can be small boundaries. It doesn't have to be this huge thing of like, I don't know, the first boundary you set is I'm not spending Christmas with your family this year. Like that's big. Maybe that will be something you work towards. And maybe the boundary is I'm going to drive separately to your family's house this year so that if I need to leave because my energy boundary gets depleted quickly, then I can do that. Or maybe your boundary is going to be I'm not going to drink alcohol at family Christmas this year. And I'm going to drink soda water, or Diet Coke or whatever. And people might ask you, hey, drink Coke or alcohol. And you might say, no, thank you. I don't want that. So it doesn't have to be huge. Or even in your business, I've got Christmas on my mind because I just bought a Christmas tree, one of those like little Christmas trees. And I've been like itching to decorate it. All the Christmas examples are coming out. But it might be things like spending money on gifts for clients or employees. And you might have found something really great for a client that's double the budget that you wanted to spend. And so your money boundary might be like, oh, I really like that, but unfortunately it's outside my budget. Or it might be that you have closed your professional development budget and you're like, you know what, there's this really great professional development. However, we've closed the budget for this year. Not doing that. And being able to own your decisions, own the boundaries that you have for yourself so that you're able to make decisions that feel really aligned for you. And when you start with those smaller boundaries, then like, for example, a smaller boundary might be you go and get, like you buy your team a coffee every day, which is, I don't know, $30. But that's daily and it's eating into your profits. You might pull that boundary back and say, I'm only going to do that once a week. For example, you can start your boundaries at whatever feels okay for you. And then as you get more and more confident, so now my lip gloss, that wouldn't even be a thing. Like I could have my lip gloss on the table and I guarantee you, like no one would touch it because I now come across as don't fuck with me. Not in a rude way, but in a self-assured, confident, I know who I am way. And I can't imagine anyone reaching across and doing that. Because as your confidence with setting boundaries grows, people will see that. People will see that shift in your energy. People will see it in the way that you hold yourself, in the way that you talk, in the way that you look, maybe in the way that you dress. And if somebody did reach across for my lip balm now, I wouldn't be waiting until they'd like unscrewed the lid. I like would say something as soon as I saw them eyeball it. Because I know that I'm deserving of being able to set that boundary. And being able to have like a boundary rich environment is healthy. It enables you to really know who you are and is then going to help you achieve your financial goals because you're not leaking all of this time, energy, money, spirituality everywhere to people and things and situations that, quite frankly, don't deserve it. You're allowed to hold that within yourself and maintain your energy and your composure and your peace and your well-being, and boundaries help you do that. So I hope this episode has really helped you to unpack boundaries a little bit more, help you think about what your boundaries are, help you realize that you are worthy and deserving of setting those boundaries, and lean into the discomfort of setting them. Because I guarantee you, the other person on the other end is also going to feel a little bit discomfortable. I was going to say uncomfortable. And that's okay. It's okay to disappoint people. It's okay if they don't like your boundary. Your job is not to please other people. Your job is not to protect the emotions of other people. And I think that is something that we need to unlearn. So with all that being said, thank you for listening to this episode of the Rich Woman Rising podcast. And if you want to learn and unpack more about your money blocks, and if you want to unpack how you can crack the code to wealth so that you can grow your revenue, so that you can heal your relationship with money, so that you can really understand your subconscious blocks, then I really encourage you to check out the secret podcast, which I'm going to drop in the show notes for you. You can register for that and get access to that exclusive podcast, which will dive deep into more of that psychology and subconscious reprogramming, which, oh my gosh, I love so much. Okay, on that note, I'm going to let you go and I will chat to you all again next week.